Good afternoon, everyone. Everybody hear me okay? I'm Luis Alvarez. I'm the director of the Institute of Arts and Humanities, and I offer a warm welcome to yet another fantastic event in our Challenging Conversations series. Today's event is the end of history, lessons of East European totalitarianism for the postmodern world. We're thrilled with such a turnout and have a terrific program in store for you this afternoon. Before we introduce our fabulous lineup of speakers, I do want to share a brief word about IAH and really the genesis of today's event. First, however, a huge thank you and shout out to our fabulous events person, Joelle Fusara, who helped make all this happen. The Cross Cultural Center for hosting us, as well as the Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies program, the Jewish Studies program, and the German Studies program for co-sponsoring today's event. In just its first year, the Institute of Arts and Humanities, aka the IAH, is a hub for all things arts and humanities at UC San Diego. We strive to cultivate and encourage interdisciplinary research, teaching, and public dialogue, aim to equip students, faculty, and the general public with the creativity, empathy, and analysis for imagining and putting into practice a more collaborative and equitable human experience, and try to highlight how the promise of the arts and humanities stands tall in the face of a seeming onslaught of inhumanity. Inspired what might be called the politics of the possible, IAH wants to bring us all together, students, faculty, the public, to collaboratively make sense of the past, navigate the present, and imagine a brighter future. Challenging Conversations, the series that today's event is a part of, is part of this ambitious vision. When we first imagined Challenging Conversations as a flagship series for IAH, we simply wanted to bring difficult topics and questions to the table for smart folks to discuss in generative and even disorienting fashion. The challenge in Challenging Conversations was intended to be about how and with whom we think and speak as much as what we think and speak. This continues to be the case, of course, but the idea of a challenging conversation has taken on new meaning in recent months. It seems as if we are all mired in one big, extended, challenging conversation that we wake up to every day. Tectonic political shifts have at once inspired folks to stand up, speak back to power, and do the right things for the right reasons, and recall the longer histories of such struggle. Following that lead, IAH has recently hosted Challenging Conversations on race and state violence, on from Japanese American internment to the Muslim ban, and will host two more before the year's end, one on May 18th with UCLA Professor Kelly Lytle Hernandez on immigration and border policing, and another on June 1st with Princeton Professor Keeanga Yamada-Taylor on From Black Lives Matters to Black Liberation. This confluence of history with the present and the future also brings us all together today. I share a bit of this backstory to highlight the goal of Challenging Conversations and the hope that we all come together collectively and collaboratively, this afternoon and moving forward. It's along these lines that IAH is honored to team up with our Kindred Institute, the new international institute here at UC San Diego, and have made today an extra special extravaganza of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. In this same room, at 4 p.m. will be the International Institute's inaugural event with UC Berkeley Professor Wendy Brown on populism, authoritarianism, and making fascism fun again. So we hope you all will stick around for that too. And with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Professor Amelia Glaser. She is Professor of Literature and Director of both the Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies and Jewish Studies program here at UCSD. She will introduce our panelists, serve as our moderator, and I should add, had the brilliant idea of making this all happen just a few months ago.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much to Luis and to Mark for actually making it happen, allowing this to take place. My favorite book by the 2015 Nobel laureate in literature, Svetlana Alexievich, is her 2013 Secondhand Time, which came out this summer in English translation. It's a book about, it's a book of interviews where Russians, contemporary Russians and former Soviet citizens grapple with the history of what it means to have lived through the Soviet Union, both the good and the bad. And she includes interviews with people who say things like, yes, we stood in line for discolored chicken and rotting potatoes, but it was our motherland. I loved it. It was a great nation. So to those of us who study Eastern Europe, there's something unsettlingly familiar about the recent change in outlook in the United States. There's this kind of hearkening back to greatness that's somewhat akin to a frightening evocation of both wartime and Cold War nostalgia for the Soviet Union, as well as for an earlier American period of pride. I don't want to suggest that we're descending into Stalinism, Nazism, or even the Cold War again. That would be too simple. And in some ways, it would almost be kitsch. But rather than succumbing to this kind of kitsch, this is a point when I feel we need to reassess and very carefully reevaluate our own situation for what is new about it and also what is familiar about it. So to that end, we've gathered together a number of scholars today, historians of Eastern Europe, to talk about this idea of the end of history and what's happening with that idea now. Francis Fukuyama called the rise in liberal democracy that came with the fall of the Berlin Wall after 1989, the end of history. And the question is, today, are we coming to the end of that end of history? What is the place for liberal democracy today? What is the place for what some would call neoliberalism today? I feel that East European scholars, East European historians in particular, are especially well situated to begin to answer this question. So to that end, I'm going to ask all of the scholars today, we'll have them each give a presentation, and then we'll follow it by discussion. And I hope that some of you will also ask some questions. But some of the questions that might come up are, do we need to know about East European history in the United States to understand 2017? Are terms like totalitarianism and authoritarianism useful for our own context? Does rhetoric that brings us back to a moment centered in the Cold War help us to understand what might be happening with today's geopolitics? So let me, with that, announce our speakers, and I'll announce them in the order that they will appear. First is my colleague Patrick Hyder Patterson, professor of history here at UC San Diego. Patrick received his PhD from the University of Michigan and his JD from the University of Virginia. His research centers on the history of 20th century Eastern Europe and the Balkans, with major emphasis on everyday life and consumer culture, and on the interplay of Islam, Christianity, and secular society. He's the author of Bought and Sold: Living and Losing the Good Life in Socialist Yugoslavia, which came out with Cornell University Press in 2011, as well as numerous articles. He is currently in the process of writing another book called Making Choices: Consumers, Commerce, and Communism in Eastern Europe, which is still forthcoming. Stephen Seegel, who's sitting just to the left of Patrick, or to your right of Patrick, is Associate Professor of History at the University of Northern Colorado. He received both his MA and his PhD from Brown. Stephen is the author of Mapping Europe's Borderlands: Russian Cartography in the Age of Empire, which came out with the University of Chicago Press in 2012. Ukraine Under Western Eyes, which came out with Harvard University Press and was reissued in 2013, and Map Men: Transnational Lives and Deaths of Geographers in the Making of East Central Europe, which is coming out with the University of Chicago Press in 2018. Marci Shore is professor of history at Yale University. She's the translator of Mikhail Golubinsky's The Black Seasons. She's the author of Caviar and Ashes: A Warsaw Generation's Life and Death in Marxism from 1918 to 1968, and of The Taste of Ashes: The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe. Her book about the 2013-2014 revolution in Ukraine, called The Ukrainian Night: An Intimate History of Revolution, is forthcoming with Yale University Press, hopefully by the end of 2017. And she's also at work on a longer book project titled The Phenomenological Encounters Scenes from Central Europe. Timothy Snyder is, in addition to being one of the leading American historians and public intellectuals, a very well-known historian in Europe, where he does most of his research. Timothy is the Hausen Professor of History at Yale University, as well as a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. He received his doctorate from the University of Oxford. Among his publications are 6 single-authored, award-winning books. All of these are translated. One of them is Nationalism, Marxism, and Modern Central Europe, a biography of Kazimierz Kelles-Kraus, which came out in 1998 but was reissued in 2016. The Reconstruction of Nations, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, from 1569 to 1998. That came out in 2003. Sketches from a Secret War, A Polish Artist's Mission to Liberate Soviet Ukraine, 2005. The Red Prince, The Secret Lives of a Habsburg Archduke, 2008. And Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, which came out in 2010. Tim has also co-edited a couple of books and co-authored together with Tony Jett a thematic history of political ideas and intellectuals in politics, Thinking the 20th Century, which came out in 2012. A brief note, Timothy Snyder's out, I believe, last week. This book is called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. This book is already #1 on the Washington Post bestseller list, and it's also on the New York Times bestseller list. I understand that this book began as a viral Facebook post that many of us probably read shortly after the election, 20 Lessons on Defending Democracy in the 20th Century, and the press has issued these very handy reminders of those 20 lessons, which you can all put up in your refrigerators. Timothy is going to be appearing again during his visit to the West Coast on Friday, March 24th at D.G. Will's bookstore in downtown La Jolla to talk about his book, and there will be available copies to purchase. I believe that's at 7 p.m. Is that correct? So that's not this Friday, but the following Friday. I'm going to go ahead and pass these around so that you can, take a look at the 20 points. But we'll go ahead and get started, and I would like to introduce Patrick as our first speaker.
Thank you, Amelia. Thanks, Luis. Thanks to everybody at the Institute, Arts and Humanities. It's great to be here, and especially with these people to have as fellow sifters of the lessons of history. If you think of, as Amelia's remarks suggest, and I suspect we'll hear more about this, the topic of the end of history is one that is, you could call it challenging. Challenging, of course, these days is the preferred euphemism for problematic or difficult. These are going to be challenging conversations. But to my mind, if you think about it in sort of academic terms, everything that you see in the title of the presentations today, the end of history, lessons of East European totalitarianism for the postmodern world, pretty much every one of those terms is problematic, is challenged, is under siege, in fact, in academic circles. Is there an Eastern Europe we can talk about? Totalitarianism, has it been largely discredited as an academic category of analysis? What's the postmodern world? What's postmodern? What's the world? And the end of history, I think you have this idea of the weaknesses there, but arguably the most problematic term for historians is lessons. We don't necessarily do lessons in the sense that I suspect many of the people in this audience are coming for. Lessons about the future and lessons about the present. The vanilla work that we do tends to be questions of cause and effect, explaining change over time in the past, maybe contemporaneous meaning. But lessons, prescriptions, we don't necessarily do that. Emboldened a little bit by Tim's viral Facebook post and the new book and the explicit 20 lessons. I'm going to try and do that. I'm going to try and sift the history of the region that I know best, Eastern Europe, and I'll leave it a time or two, for some lessons that we might use. So, lesson 1, the slippery slope is real. Pay attention to how authoritarianisms began. I think the flash and bang, the shock and awe of the rapid Nazi seizure of power, the consolidation of power after the Nazis won their election victory and were asked to take over the German government, when they then proceeded to really take over the German government and dismantle the Weimar Republic, I think that Nazi example is misleading. If we look at Eastern Europe, we see that, in fact, there's a big danger of creeping authoritarianism, a kind of authoritarianism that grows slowly. I'm going to suggest that many of the examples of history from Eastern Europe are not necessarily the ones we would most immediately think of. The World War II era fascisms that took root, the communist authoritarianisms of the period after 1945. There are other cases as well, before and after the events of World War II, that fascism, after the Cold War as well. Hungary and Poland today are probably not, in my judgment, over the line to fully authoritarian states, but there are plenty of illiberal and anti-democratic features, and the danger of authoritarianism there is very real indeed. It's difficult for historians to work with counterfactuals. That's another thing we don't like to do. But if the task in front of us is one of drawing lessons for the broader public about authoritarian rule and how to avoid it, then we need to think about and talk about what I would call authoritarianisms averted, about those that did not take root fully and those that passed comparatively quickly. We need to get out of our comfort zone and think about history that way a little bit. And along those lines, I would suggest that we take a closer look at the Croatia of Franjo Tuđman, after Croatian independence until Tuđman's death in 1999, Serbia under and after Milosevic, Croatia following Tuđman's death. These are cases in which the polities evolved away from some very illiberal, if not fully authoritarian tendencies. In those places, Fukuyama, I think those cases right there suggest the difficulties with Fukuyama's argument, the end of history, the permanent victory of liberal democracy. Tuđman's Croatia and Milosevic's Serbia came right on the heels of 1989. The end of history never began. They show us that. Slovakia might have been headed in that same direction under Mečiar in the 1990s, but generally has moved in more liberal directions. So I think it could be profitable to use these more unfamiliar examples from East European history to think about how authoritarianisms begin and how they might be averted. Lesson 2, the authoritarians are right. Liberal democratic institutions are weak. They are, I think Eastern Europe suggests, far more fragile than we might hope. The record indicates to me that they can be swept away pretty easily. If you look at Czechoslovakia, 1945 to 1948, before the communist rise to power, many countries in the region during the interwar period between the two world wars. I think that's one of the lessons that we can take away from that. Not that many people live with a give me liberal democracy or give me death mentality, right? So the attachments can be shaken. They're not as weak, they're not as strong as we'd like to believe. Lesson 3, resist early, resist often. Raise the costs of moving toward illiberalism. Once authoritarian governments are in power, the cost calculation of fighting for liberal democracy shifts radically. So the time to impose costs on authoritarians and on those who would support them is early on in the cycle. And if liberal institutions are weak, liberal publics can be strong, but they have to be mobilized to be strong. Lesson 4, ideologies matter, but security and grievance may matter even more. Again, the power of those very clearly articulated Nazi ideologies, the Marxist-Leninist ideologies of the communist states can dazzle us and I think ultimately mislead us. Grievance matters. And if you're looking for lessons applicable to the United States, as I think many of you are, grievance is a category we have to take very seriously. So I'm reminded of the grievances that helped sustain a different kind of authoritarianism in the interwar period in Hungary under Miklos Horthy. Not a fascism, a more traditionalist kind of authoritarianism. Security. I think here of the sanacja, the healing regime of Marshal Piłsudski in Poland, late 1920s until his death in 1935 and even after that. There's this promise of restoration in both of those cases, a promise of healing. These authoritarian regimes come to power and they stay in power, I think, because they appeal very powerfully to those concerns of security and grievance. The ideology can address that, but it often matters less. Liberal democracies, therefore, need to find effective ways of doing that. The big danger here for the United States is, in my judgment, what would happen if there's a very serious terror attack on the order of 9/11 or something worse. I think even committed liberal Democrats would find it hard to avoid the imposition of many, many, many illiberal measures in the face of that kind of event. Those who are not fully committed to liberal democracy will move in that direction even more readily. Security and grievance. Number 4, lesson 4, beware the fellow travelers and the comrades in arms. I am encouraged to see that Tim has this down as his lesson number 6, be wary of paramilitaries. Probably best, I think, to reserve the term authoritarian for systems in which the forces of repression actually have control of the organs of the state. But there are plenty of those people who are not in the government who have strong impulses toward authoritarianism. And they give the authoritarian government plenty of cover. They give it plausible deniability. They say, oh, this is not the government's action. This is action of citizens. And look, we see what the citizens want. So that strengthens the hand of the authoritarian governments. It shields them as they move to commit violence and abuse against their populations. Here again, I think the liberal, freedom-valuing part of liberal democracy can be a weakness. It can be its undoing. We have to keep that in mind. The presence of a rich civil society, that is to say, a robust non-governmental sphere of action, can allow these anti-liberal fellow travelers to flourish and prosper. So special efforts need to be made to check them. Lesson 6, many people end up complicit with authoritarian rule. True resistance to the system as such is fairly rare. I'm reminded here of Detlef Peukert's analysis of everyday life in Nazi Germany and his scale of opposition, starting with a kind of personal, individual nonconformity to the norms of the authoritarian state, a kind of private individual matter, moving to a little bit more public beyond those things like different kind of hairstyles, dress, and so forth, forbidden music, moving on to the refusal to follow specific directions or orders, then into a more public sphere, into the realm of protest action against specific policies and programs of the authoritarian government, and then finally to resistance, a term Peukert reserves only for acts that are directed against the system in toto, the system as a whole. Again, I'm not really concerned so much here with the debate, and maybe it's a sterile one, over whether we should call all of these acts resistance, but rather, I think the critical lesson is this. Very few people end up actively engaged against the system as a whole. Why? Because once authoritarian governments have control of the state, the costs they impose for resistance, opposition, nonconformity are simply too high. There are some episodes from East European history of interesting, dramatic, even violent protest. There is not much in the way of anti-system opposition. Those few intellectuals who styled themselves as dissidents proved ultimately, I think, fairly manageable for the East European communist governments, for example. A related lesson on this point is that the time to resist, in the fullest, most system-challenging sense of that word, is very early on, before the costs become too high. A further related lesson here is if you resist early and you still lose, the cost will be very high indeed. There will be horrible retributions. Same is going to be true if you resist during the tenure of an authoritarian government and then lose, as Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968 teach us. Lesson 7, it is very difficult to dislodge or end authoritarianisms without a combination of domestic and foreign pressures and incentives to do that. Pay attention to how authoritarianisms end, and especially to the importance of outside pressure for the end of authoritarian rules. I'm thinking here's a non-Eastern Europe example, of China's persistent authoritarianism today, of Russia's resurgent authoritarianism after that brief, more liberal Yeltsin moment. There's no sign that either of those will be ended anytime soon. And it's easy to imagine that the current illiberal regimes in Hungary and Poland right now may stay in place. Once authoritarian regimes are in place, they are typically ended, I think, by a combination of domestic dissatisfaction and foreign intervention, or at least powerful foreign pressure and incentives. There's an American example here. The United States of America was an authoritarian society for its enslaved population. And vast parts of it were authoritarian toward African Americans even much, much later. I didn't realize it, but when I was born in 1963, I was born in an authoritarian state, Tennessee. That authoritarian state was swept away formally by the time I was conscious, dislodged by a combination of outside power, federal intervention, and new cultural and social regimes that imposed big new costs on at least overt racism. Obviously, those values haven't been totally swept away, but they have been removed largely, not entirely, from governmental practice. The lesson for the US, if you want one, is that as the world's biggest superpower, there will be nobody to save us if we don't save ourselves. It is hard to imagine any kind of compelling outside intervention to pull us away from a committed, entrenched authoritarian system. Lesson 8, the final one. Too often, authoritarianisms don't end soon enough. In some cases, it's important to know when to get out if you can. Eastern Europe speaks in tragic volumes on this. Here, too, the very understandable desire that human beings have for security can be your undoing. It's very hard to walk away from your home, walk away from your job, from your friends, your family, but the time may come to seek refuge, or else it may be too late. Thanks.
A quick note that I neglected to make in my introduction. This panel, despite what it says on the posters, will be going until 2:30, so there will be time for questions after the panelists have made their comments.
In drastically simplified form, Fukuyama's thesis in his 1992 bestseller, The End of History and the Last Man, boils down to an early 19th century ism, an ideology of progress. It goes something like this. History is universal. History has meaning. Humanity moves forward in history. History guides us toward ever greater liberty, as Hegel thought, in a dynamic straight line or as dialectic. History gives us technology, innovation, a civil society, and institutions. When conflicts exist, they will be overcome by a hidden, providential spirit which we can discern. In the post-'89 status quo version of this, capitalism and democracy will converge and prosper. Elections and democracy will solve problems. Happy endings are near, either through the state, the market, or their marriage. Can we really just sit back and eat popcorn, as Tim once put it? This straw man looks like economics stripped of politics, politics stripped of ideas, philosophical dialogues without the ancient world, Socrates and the sophists. Fukuyama's optimism captures a dying mood about globalization, one not shared by Europe's pessimists before World War I, Freud, Weber, Nietzsche, and so on. There were some optimists of sorts. For instance, in 1876, the Czech philosopher Tomáš Masaryk defended Plato's Republic, in an early work called Plato as Patriot, Plato jako vlastenec. A staunch defender of legislative order, the future president of Czechoslovakia, 3 days, sorry, shut it off.
So sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm totally interrupting.
Okay,
Sorry.
no problem.
Sorry about that. The laptop's hidden under here when it gets closed.
Okay. I'll just keep talking and then you can do that. So Masaryk, a defender of legislative order, the president of Czechoslovakia 3 days after World War I ended, had long served in parliament and imperial public affairs. A sociologist, there we go, a sociologist turned politician, he also actively opposed modern nationalism. In this knockoff world of knowledge transfer, such wide connections to Central East European history are present. Fukuyama's prophecy rests on several assumptions against what I'll call aggressive anti-liberalism, about which two things are forgotten. So this is the term I'll prefer. The first was that his book, like Huntington's neo-nativist Clash of Civilizations in 1996, was previewed as a short article. In Fukuyama's '89 version, he simply titled his essay, The End of History. But he punctuated it, most important thing, with a question mark, not an exclamation point. In addition, The Last Man, part of the title, was a gratuitous Nietzsche reference. Der letzte Mensch of the 1880s was a man of his time, of growing intolerance, alienation, mediocrity, and mass politics. The last man is the antithesis of the Superman, the transgressor, the aesthete, the Trump, the philosopher as psychologist, a scourge of values, Raskolnikov, the embracer of a new eternity. The second forgotten thing is Fukuyama's heavily transmitted debt to German idealism, not so much to the American Hegel, which is also true, but to one of Hegel's most important 20th century interpreters, a Russian, in fact, the polymath Russian, Jewish, French historian of ideas, Alexander Vladimirovich Kozhevnikov, born 1902. Nephew of the artist Vasily Kandinsky, he fled the Bolshevik Revolution. He was a student of Karl Jaspers and indirectly Heidegger. The émigré came to be known in French Marxist circles of the 30s as Alexander Kojève. So this is a long digression. Kojève, like Fukuyama and Masaryk, trafficked in ideas. Out of Central East Europe, alongside such thinkers as Lukács, Arendt, and Kołakowski, he was among the 20th century's great students of Marxism, a god that failed. He lectured in Paris from 1933 to 39. He was suspicious of totality, the totalizing power of states, history, and government. He was neither determinist nor nationalist. He spoke French, German, Russian, and English all fluently, and just for fun, he taught himself Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, Latin, and ancient Greek. He refused the notion, in the early Cold War, that capitalism and democracy were failed projects, and this put him in a distinct minority. During World War II, he worked for the French Ministry of Economic Affairs, and in support of the European Common Market, a forerunner to the EU, he favored European autonomy to resist basically a debate from the 1830s between right Hegelianism, as he called it in the US, and left Hegelianism, as he would call it in the USSR. His most influential book was on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. This is for Marci, written in 1947. In short, Kojève was a 20th century transnational man. He found home very uncomfortably among the alienated in a multilingual world of literature, history, philosophy, and ideas. Just a short quote from his 1947 book, and I'll talk a little bit about the Cold War and totalitarianism. Quote, "Man can free himself from a given world that does not satisfy him only if this world, in its totality, belongs to a real or sublimated master. Now, as long as the master lives, he himself is always enslaved by the world of which he is the master. But as long as the master lives, he never attains the freedom that would raise him above the given world. The master can never detach himself from the world in which he lives, and if this world dies, he dies with it. Only the slave can transform the world that forms him and fixes him in slavery, and create a world he has formed in which he will be free. Koshev's Russian Hegel influenced major thinkers, Simone de Beauvoir, Ramon Aron in France, as well as, let's say, Herbert Marcuse right here to UCSD. These were very different intellectuals in the 20th century. Out of the Frankfurt School's modern obsessions with bureaucracy, technique, and media, not to mention the authoritarian personality, the new lefty Marcuse came to refer to the US as totalitarian, TT, during the 60s student movement. There are interesting exchanges, by the way, that Kołakowski had with Marcuse and E.P. Thompson and many, many others. Anyway, the Marcusean line on the left runs straight through to usages of TT among Occupy Democrats and radicals. Just to give an example, the writings of Sheldon Wolin, who just died in 2015, who used the concept of inverted totalitarianism to refer to, guess what, in the 2000s, US managed democracy, corporatocracy, the war on terror, privatization, and so on, where populations are rendered helpless. Now, such lefty points and debates, however obscurantis, might seem ridiculous, even like truisms. But in an aggressively anti-liberal age like ours, anxiety about creeping masters and creeping TT is actually nothing new. One more example. There is a May 1948 article in the New York Times, penned during the context of the communist coup in Czechoslovakia, penned during the Truman era and its convening of the National Security Resources Board. The article lists a whopping 15 components to the anti-liberal TT state. Let me read a few and see if these sound familiar. 1948. 1. Abolition of the right to freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religious worship. 2. Elimination of all political parties other than the ruling party. 4. Suppression of individual initiative. 5. Destruction of all independent trade unions, creation of labor organizations servile to the TT state. 7. Utter disregard for an independent judicial system. Creation of courts completely subject to the control of centralized political authority. 8. Glorification of a single leader who is all-powerful and subject neither to criticism nor removal through the ballot. 9. Utilitarianism of a special form of social demagogy, for example, the incitement of a race or class versus another race or class. 11. Reduction of parliamentary bodies to a rubber stamp status. 12. Establishment of a system of nationwide espionage and secret police. 13. Severance of contact between the people of TT states and those of other countries through travel and other personal restrictions. 15. Maintenance and encouragement of fifth columns abroad. From Hannah Arendt and her classic 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, experts spawned a cottage industry of lists like these in the 1950s. In the experience in Eastern Europe, I'll come to this after Stalin's death in 1953, TT critics took off, for example, in Poland, while Władysław Gomulka's regime was losing control. This is ironic considering the gains of control today. Even to investigate the sociology of totalitarianism or authoritarianism was a very powerful discursive weapon in the resistance. From 1956, the Hungarian Revolution, through the Prague Spring, to Solidarity. Experience of TT in police states was never in Eastern Europe just a polite academic debate or a cafe pose in front of peers. Take the Warsaw School of the History of Ideas from 1955, and I'll nod to Tim's 1997 review essay here in Contemporary European History. The Warsaw School of the History of Ideas is largely unknown in the United States. Bronisław Baczko, Leszek Kołakowski, whom Tim quotes from at the beginning, Andrzej Falicki, Krzysztof Pomian, Jerzy Szacki, all of these people were involved one way or another in it. All of them were breathing persons who lost quite a bit for their involvement in it. In 1966, Kołakowski, one of the great historians of Marxism in the 20th century, together with Pomian, were exiled from the Faculty of History in Warsaw after they publicly lamented the lack of democratic institutions in Poland. Being critical of Orthodox Marxism and the Polish one-party state got them removed, and then without them, the school dissolved in 1968. As for Kojève, he might seem like a revolutionary today. Supporter of a blue state called the European Common Market, he died appropriately for a Europhile in Brussels in 1968. What can we learn from this? I hesitate to draw lessons. I'm not too preachy, I don't think. But nevertheless, I'll try. Today, oligarchic, Trumpist, Putinist, aggressive anti-liberalism, this is my shorthand for totalitarianism, is how the old Visegrad Europe of the 1990s is ruled. Czech President Miloš Zeman was one of the first to congratulate Trump, for he is a little Trump, on his election. In Hungary and Poland, it took about 1 year, maybe 2.5, to get rid of the institutions that sustained democracy for 25 years. We're now in the business, or rather the art, of historical blunder. As Tim put it in his 1997 essay, this might be your Juvenilia or maybe Incunabula. I love this quote because it's a nod to Tony Jutt's study of the French left, quote, "Each generation of scholars faces the same dilemma, bound to see the errors committed by its predecessors, but unable to grasp the character of its own particular subjectivity," unquote. States today, aggressively illiberal ones especially, by their electoral maps, are in the irrational business of rational population control and mobilization. Nations fight back by manipulating maps up from the ground, gerrymandering, for example, but generally speaking, in a country of unchecked CEOs and executive power, the state, however powerful, maps the nation into grids and rectangles, races and nationalities, not the other way around. Some final thoughts in place of lessons. The line from Hegel and Masaryk in the 19th century to Kojève and Fukuyama and our little Trumps in the 20th and 21st century tells us something about aggressive anti-liberalism today. Those pills of Murti Bing, to quote Miłosz, that we now seem obliged to swallow, a reference to Miłosz's captive mind from 1951. From Hegel in 1807, Kojève believed that the philosopher or historian who strives to know himself and others can arrive at fuller self-consciousness. As Hegel put it in his preface to the Philosophy of Right in 1821, what is rational is real, and what is real is rational. It might be the shortest sentence that Hegel ever wrote. So postmodernism, rightly or wrongly in conclusion, may now have come to mean what is bad, constructed, false, mendacious, relativistic, or just PR. I'm not sure about that. But in any case, the Trumpist-Putinist order is a media space inherited from Cold War geopolitical pasts, one that generates the infotainment of actionable threat. In such an order, living in truth, a favorite phrase of Havel, with a nod to Patočka, his philosopher of choice, becomes a radical act of citizenship. Risk-averse citizens may not be supermen, but they are the Arendtian opposite of TT and the mass man, the bourgeoisie, the peer-phobic, lever-pulling, circle-filling, button-pinning creatures of blithe globalization, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The professional placeholders in a society of job holders. From Plato to NATO, and hopefully beyond, they too are products of a long history, the Central and East European laboratory of ideas. Ethical democracies cannot function without them. Thank you.
Okay. Well, is this working? Can you hear me? Okay. Well, that was great. I had no idea that Fukuyama got his Hegel from Kojève. Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, so now I'm actually wondering if the last man comes from Derrida's Ends of Man. Okay, I'm not going to let myself get distracted, but that was, thank you very much. I actually meant to start by thanking Luis for his receptiveness to this idea. I'm not a person who generally tries to involve myself in contemporary politics, especially as a Slavicist, American contemporary politics. But it feels like a kind of extreme moment of moral urgency. Thank you to Joelle for organizing, to Amelia, my partner in crime, for all things for the better part of 2 decades, and for Patrick and Stephen for agreeing to do this. I hadn't spoken to Patrick in a few years, but I had this sense, judging from his Facebook posts, that here was another East Europeanist who shares my deep sense of panic. Okay, let me maybe start here. A few years ago, for me, we're kind of now on this kind of historical narrative or a rupture in time that began for me, I think, with the Ukrainian Revolution of 2013 to 2014, because that was just at the moment when we were supposed to be celebrating the 25th anniversary of the fall of communism and the beginning of the end of history. And nobody had really expected that was actually going to be the beginning of the end of history. And it was precisely at the moment when East Europeanists were about to come to terms with the fact that 25 years had passed, Eastern Europe no longer existed, nobody really believed it existed, now everyone was part of the European Union, the European Union would eventually expand, we were all going to live happily ever after. And then when the Ukrainian Revolution broke out, kind of precisely at that moment where it seemed that there was no more Eastern Europe and there was no more difference, the difference no longer mattered, we had overcome this difference. I found myself in Vienna, and purely for the coincidental reason that I was in Vienna, I was reading the German press a lot more than I would have been if I had been here. I was also reading the English press, of course, and I was reading the Polish press, which I thought had the best coverage of what was happening in Ukraine. And it was then impossible not to notice the radical discrepancy between the Polish coverage and the German language coverage. And it wasn't simply that the Germans were not especially sympathetic, and the Austrians were vaguely sympathetic but not very understanding, and the Poles were more sympathetic. It wasn't necessarily a question of sympathy. It was actually a question of understanding. I felt like that the Germans and the Austrians didn't understand what was happening, and the Poles intuitively did understand what was happening. And I thought, well, what is this understanding based on? Why are certain things intuitive, and why is that difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe still there? And one of the things I understood was that West Europeanists, I think like Americans at this moment, or West Europeans, let's say, not West Europeanists, believed, even if only subliminally, that there were constraints on reality, that certain things were on the other side of a boundary of the possible. And East Europeans, even 25 years after the fall of communism, they understood that anything is possible. They understood that everything can look perfectly fine and normal today, but it could turn on a dime. You might not necessarily stress about that every day, but you know it. It's just something that you understand. And if I talk for the next few minutes about history lessons, and I share Patrick's feeling that, one, I don't particularly enjoy speaking so normatively, and two, I'm skeptical about lessons. The lessons of history are that it discloses what is possible. Once you know something is possible and once you understand something is possible, that doesn't mean the same thing will happen again, but it means you have an understanding of what is possible. When Jan Orban in Hungary declared, his illiberal democracy, I found that Americans thought, well, that's just an oxymoron. It's someone speaking nonsensically. But it's actually not an oxymoron, because liberalism and democracy were never the same thing. And in part, it's our failure to have appreciated that may have landed us in the present moment. The fact that the masses, the people, the majority can participate is no guarantee that they will vote for liberalism. It's no guarantee they'll choose liberalism. It's no guarantee, that masses of people participating in the political process will lead to virtuous choices. Democracy and liberalism have never been the same thing. Liberalism has always been fragile. It has always borne the same fragilities that the Enlightenment rationalism out of which it emerged has borne. A kind of existential thinness, an exaltation of reason, a willful refusal to acknowledge, in some sense, the darker side of human nature, which Dostoevsky so poignantly in Underground Man expresses. What is reason? Reason is only reason. Desires are a manifestation of the whole of life. It's also not the case that nobody illiberal has ever come to power by democratic means. Even before the totalitarian experiments of the 20th century, the Habsburg liberals, who were themselves fighting for the expansion of the franchise, found that as the franchise expanded and more people could vote, they lost power, not gained power. Hitler obviously infamously comes to power in a democratic election. The Ukrainian Revolution of 2013 to 2014 overthrew a dictator at the cost of a massacre. And that dictator had been democratically elected just a few years before. And the people who went out onto the streets and decided they were willing to give their lives to overthrow him perfectly well understood that he had been democratically elected. Putin today enjoys authentically overwhelming popular support. And even the Russian oppositionists and critics who are very skeptical about the 86% figure will tell you that, well, perhaps it's only in the high 70s. But nobody actually disputes that he authentically has overwhelming support. This existential thinness of Enlightenment rationalism has always been among the vulnerabilities of liberalism. And one of the things I found was so often misunderstood during our own presidential election last year was that, for instance, when supporters of Trump would say that they admired him for his honesty. And that's an interesting question, because what is honesty? I mean, honesty in this case clearly doesn't refer to an actual correspondence between what he says and empirical reality, because there is no such correspondence. And that was quite clear. I mean, there was a lovely New Yorker satire about the fact checker who passes out from exhaustion at the end of the Republican debate. But the fact that his supporters stated that it was honesty that drew them to him doesn't mean that they weren't seeing something that was real. What they were seeing was, in fact, something that might have more accurately been expressed by authenticity. And that's something we can understand by going back to what Freud tells us in Civilization and Its Discontents, which is one of his last books, as he writes, watching the failure of liberalism throughout Europe. And Freud says that, eros and thanatos, the death drive and lust, are always present in us. Civilization is based on a repression of those instincts. That is why it cannot but make us unhappy, because civilization is about repressing our desires to rape and kill people. But Freud says there is no other way, because the cost of liberation from repression is the destruction of civilization. What Trump promised with his alleged honesty was liberation from repression. That is an authentic liberation, for which we pay only the small price of the destruction of civilization. I mean, We are then in the Dostoevskian world of God is dead and everything is permitted. Freud at this time, in the early 20th century, lost the battle for the hearts and minds of Europeans to Marx, who, unlike Freud, promised happily ever after. And Freud said there is going to be no happily ever after because civilization cannot make us unhappy. And now in the 21st century, we see that Freud is having his revenge. Let me just say a couple words in conclusion about what I think we learn in particular from Eastern Europe. And this will go back to something that Patrick began with. We learn from Eastern Europe how quickly the borders can slip. We learn how quickly people can rationalize things that would have seemed inconceivable. One of the things I started thinking about right after the election was the Romanian playwright Eugene Ionesco's famous play Rhinoceros, which I hadn't taught in a number of years, and now I'm returning to. And Ionesco, in his memoirs, when he describes writing the Rhinoceros, he says, well, in the beginning, when he's a young intellectual in fascist Romania or becoming fascist Romania, he says, in the beginning, of course, we weren't fascist. In the beginning, there was a group of a dozen or 15 of us, and we used to get together to construct arguments to counter theirs. And then one by one, the people in our group would start to say, well, I don't agree with them, to be sure, but about certain matters, for instance, the Jews. And that was a sign, a week later, and that person would have joined the Iron Guard and become a fascist. And watching this slippery slope, Ionesco wrote Rhinoceros. And a week or so after the election, I took my son to his school, his elementary school, and I ran into some of the other mothers who were talking about how upset they were. And one of the other mothers said, well, of course, I didn't vote for him. I'm very upset too, and I would never vote for him. I mean, he's completely vulgar and crass, but of course, as a businesswoman, on certain points, now that I'm thinking about it, I can see, in immigration, for instance. And I felt sick. I felt like, oh, that was right out of Ionesco's diary. Here it is. It's starting already. One of the things that I think Americans, with our very particular and very American cult of individualism, which has given us many good things, but also many blind spots, one of the things we fail to see is how circumstances shape behavior. And how there will always be people who will be heroes with extraordinary moral clarity. And there will always be a handful of sadists and people who will behave badly regardless of conditions. But the fact is, and what we learn from totalitarianism in the 20th century, that most people, most of the time, behave according to the circumstances in which they find themselves. The infamous massacre in Jedwabne, which became the most important debate about the Holocaust to take place in post-communist Europe, was a massacre that occurred in a very small Polish town in July 1941, after 21 months of Soviet occupation, right after Operation Barbarossa begins, and the Red Army withdraws, and the Wehrmacht arrives, and in this window of semi-anarchy between two totalitarian regimes, the Germans give the local Poles a few days to take care of the Jews. And this ends a couple days later with the townspeople herding all the Jews of the town, their own neighbors and their own classmates and their own friends, into the town square, herding them into a barn and setting the barn on fire. Now, many years later, the son of parents who were killed in that barn, who himself had emigrated to the United States a few years earlier and become a rabbi, was remembering one of the most enthusiastic of the murderers. And he said in an interview given at the end of his life after this story came out, he said, oh, Jurek Landowski, as a boy, he was extremely nice, and we were neighbors, and we used to talk a lot about religion because he wanted to be a priest, and I was studying Talmud. That nice boy might have remained a nice boy. The behavior that was elicited from those people never would have been elicited in other circumstances. But what totalitarianism teaches us is that there is potential inside of us to act in ways we never could have imagined, that we're not capable of imagining that the thing we find absolutely inconceivable can become the new normal just a couple weeks later, and we will have slipped without even noticing it. So if there's a lesson we take from Eastern Europe, I would say perhaps has something to do with the truly extraordinary human capacity to normalize the abnormal.
Okay, thanks very much to my predecessors for being great. I hope you realize just how interesting this has been, and I will try in the remaining quarter of an hour essentially not to let them down. The case that I want to make begins with a little bit of linguistic playfulness. The case I want to make is that the end of history is history, right? That is, what I want to say is that what we're talking about here is not so much whether one very interesting thinker in 1989 was right or wrong. We're not talking about just whether this is a particular moment. We're not talking only about just what to do, important that is. We're trying to pull off the blinders. We're trying to wake from the sleepwalking. We're trying to realize that there is only one history and there isn't a way out of it. I mean, I'm going to say a number of things, but this is the fundamental message to which I'm going to return. There is only one history and there is no way out of it. There are various ways to look for ways out of history, all of which amount to conceding your own individual responsibility for the historical moment in which you happen to find yourself. So the claim with which I want to begin, to which I will turn at the end, is that this is your history. You have a choice as to whether you want to realize that or not, right? You have the choice as to whether you prefer to believe in some scheme of determinism or some fascist myth of an infallible leader, or whether you prefer to stare at Facebook for 14 hours a day, right? Those are choices that you can make, but the history is just here in the fully depressing, but also in the fully responsibility demanding sense that I think Patrick was trying to sketch out at the end. There is only one history. There's only one world history. It's not just that no one is coming to rescue America. No one ever comes and rescues anything ever. That just doesn't happen, right? There is no outside. What we've got is this. And most of the time, it doesn't matter, right? Most of the time you can sleepwalk, Facebook, whatever it is you do. Most of the time it doesn't matter. But now it does. Okay. What are some of the other ways that people think about the past, right? What are the alternatives to history? Remember, my thesis is a very simple one. That we're living in history, right? That's my thesis, right? Maybe you're already convinced. It's a very simple thesis, but there are alternatives. I want to try to sketch out for you what I take two of the alternatives to be and how we're caught between them and how that the shift from one mistaken sense of time to another mistaken sense of time is in a way the danger. Okay, what do I mean by that? So this thing that we're calling the end of history, I'm not going to go into the details of Fukuyama. I'm just going to try to describe it as a moment, right? This idea that history is over, these lovely characteristics of a positive teleology that Steve gave and Patrick too, Marci also. This notion that everything must work out for the best, one way or another. Believing stuff like that is an action that was taken in history. Okay, that claim that history is over, the choice to believe, to formulate and to believe in stories of that kind, was an action in history that had consequences. Claims of that kind, and the informed or half-informed choice to believe in them, made a huge difference to the history of the world, right? The Iraq War, for example, was not possible without claims of that kind. Without the unbelievably over-optimistic notion that if you just knock over an authoritarian regime, democracy will spring up from the desert. Without that, the Iraq War could not have happened, right? And without the Iraq War, we're in an entirely different world. More broadly, this view, which has both a Republican and Democratic variant, right? I mean, that the arc of history bends towards justice is no more true than that democracy grows from the desert after you invade a Middle Eastern country. Those views that's the same view, right? You might find one more sympathetic than the other, but they're both fundamentally mistaken. There is no arc. There's no arc. It can't bend. It doesn't exist. There's no arc. There's no shape. It's not there. It's an illusion. It makes you slumber. Okay. So what I'm after here is that since 1989, we've been in this thing which I like to call the politics of inevitability. This notion that we're all heading someplace one way or another, which means that, and as I say, there's a version of this on the right and on the left, which means that nobody's responsible. Nobody's responsible. If there's history and it has a shape, right, then nobody's responsible. At most, our job is to kind of get the things out of the way which prevent history from making its course, which if you're a Republican might mean like economic regulations, right? But just to get the things out of the way, get the things out of the God of History's way. But fundamentally, nobody is responsible. Here, I want to return to the only, one of the few, there's a cliche which is so cliched that none of my learned predecessors has mentioned it, and that's the cliche of the light at the end of the tunnel, right? The light at the end of the tunnel. So everything is going very badly, and you say, okay, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and then your friend says, okay, but that's the oncoming train, right? That's a cliche that's so cliched that none of my colleagues would have even thought to have brought it up. I'm bringing it up to make a particular point, okay? Which is that when you look, let me think about it this way. Let's imagine you're looking into the future and you see bright stuff, right? What's the best time of day for taking photographs? You all know this. Well, you don't know this because you have good light all the time, but the best time of day to take good photographs is when light is behind you, okay? When light is behind you. You see in front of you best when light is behind you, right? So when you're looking out into the bright future, where's the train? It's behind you. The train is behind you. That's where the light is coming from, right? The train is behind you, okay? If you think that nothing can happen in the future, all you're doing is summoning up the various things that have happened in the past to run you over and leave your remains on the rails. That's what we did for the last 25 years, essentially. And when that happens, when you realize the train is behind you, right? The thing which is rolling over you, those wheels, that's a sense that history is cyclical, which is where we're going now. In Russia, in Europe, in America. Where we're going now is away from a sense that history is basically known and basically positive to a sense that everything has to go badly, right? That history is just full of various threats, right? Endless cycles of aggression, and that's all one really has to know, that one is the victim. That's all one really has to know. We're the victim. Aggression comes from the outside, and therefore nothing can really happen. We can't really reform oneself. So the danger is that we shift from one view of time, which isn't history, this inevitability business, to another view of time, which I call the politics of eternity, and which is characteristic of authoritarianism and in particular of fascism. The idea that there is a past, right? But the past is only full of one thing. It's full of people who victimize us, right? That's the past. And the danger, and you must see this, right? It's before your eyes. This is the political style of the Trump administration, okay? This shift to eternity, which has a great deal to do with Eastern Europe in the 1930s, and that's where I'm going to try to end up. History, then. So what is history? What could history do for us? How is history not these things? The first thing that history can obviously do for us, that politics of inevitability and politics of eternity cannot do, is that it can give us a certain amount of orientation. I mean, my colleagues and I will naturally have different views about the substance of some of these historical issues, but in general, we would probably agree that, and this has been stated already in more articulate ways, that history can give you a certain amount of grounding, right? Nothing repeats. Okay, so the typical American attitude about history is like, I want to hit like the same, I've got my Foreigner album, and every time I hit the button, I want like the same song to play exactly the same way. And if it doesn't play exactly the same way, then something's wrong and I don't care, right? So the moment you start talking to Americans about history, not you people, I'm sure you're very wise, right? But the moment that you start talking about American history, they say, well, is it exactly like, right? Is Trump exactly like Hitler? And they said, well, no. Is he wearing jackboots right now? No, he's not wearing jackboots right now. Is Trump Tower the shape of a swastika? No, I admit it's not the shape of a swastika, although well, okay. If you come up out of this certain angle on Fifth, anyway. So if you say no, it's not the shape. I got you to smile. I'm glad. There, okay. I've won. Okay, because you were doing that like cynical I've heard it all before thing, and like now you're smiling. All right. So but the point is that general Americans will say that if it's not exactly the same thing, then it doesn't matter. Of course, it's not exactly the same thing, but it's also not totally different. The American view that everything is new is totally disempowering, right? Because if everything is totally new every day, then that means you've manufactured your own perfect cluelessness, right? Every morning when you wake up. Everything is related to everything else. There are patterns, there are structures that you can see. So for example, there was a globalization before, right? And when the globalization happened before, everyone also said, wow, this is really new. The world's flat. There's going to be progress. There's going to be enlightenment. There's going to be prosperity. Stephen's right, there was pessimism in the early 20th century, but in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, just like in the 1970s, 1980s, and especially 1990s, there was an awful lot of optimism of the variety. Prosperity leads to enlightenment, leads to liberalism, right? That already happened once, and the reactions to it already happened once, which means that we know both that globalization can bring about this kind of thing that we're experiencing now. It also means that we have very smart people from the 20th century to listen to about what to happen when it does fail. It shows us how dark things can go, but it also shows us that there are possibly answers. Okay, so the other thing that I want to stress, and here I'm just going to borrow from what other people have said, is that history gives you company. So if everything's always new, then you're always alone, right? Because you can't have experienced anything with anyone before, right? If everything that happens is always golden and fresh and new and bright, then you can't have friends. You can't have company, because all company is historical, all friendships are historical, right? History reverses this, right? History gives you, friends would be kind of a goofy way to put it, but if you read Havel, or if you read Arendt, or if you read Miłosz, or if you read any of the other people who've been referred to before, you realize you're in the company of those who are wiser than you and experienced more than you, but whose articulate conceptualizations of these problems can make you feel more at home, right? Not just that you understand the neutral sense of the word, but you also feel that you're not by yourself. History can give you that, because it is the case that many, many people who are wiser than us have written more wisely than we could about these things. History gives us a sense that we're not alone. And I'm just borrowing now from the existence of the previous three presentations, all of which I think demonstrate this in the very fact that they took place. Okay, so I'm not going to try to repeat what the lessons are. I would just say generally that history instructs, and history provides us with these companions who can instruct us. On the lessons, so many lessons have already been given, and you have like 20 on the back of a postcard, which you are very photogenically holding right there. Thank you. Yeah, very nice. That the camera is unfortunately on me and not you, right? Because you were rocking that postcard in a way that I definitely could not. Yeah. All right. So I already have a bunch of lessons out there. I'm just going to say a couple of things which amplify some points that I think have already been made. The first is that one thing history teaches us is that other people have other ideas. Whoa, it's like Anthro 101, right? You're like, okay, I'm going to do some mental ethnography. The past really is another country, and so is the present. Other people really do have ideas that are not some version of liberal democracy, right? So one of the tendencies when somebody like Trump is elected or whatever is you mentally normalize, say, well, like he's never said he likes democracy, and a lot of times he said he doesn't. He's never said he likes human rights, and a lot of times he says he doesn't. He's never named any Democrats he likes, and he says he likes a lot of authoritarians. But nevertheless, he's never had any experience in a democratic country. He's only been a law-breaking oligarch. But nevertheless, he's probably deep down inside, he's probably a liberal Democrat. Right? Deep down, that's the impulse, right? To think, and that's a lack of imagination that history can help us with. History reminds us that people really do have different ideas. And whether we can ascertain now whether it's some variant of fascism or some less colorful version of kleptocratic authoritarianism, there are ideas which just aren't variations on liberal democracy. And that's very simple. Or to put it a different way, there is an alternative, right? I mean, this whole business of the last 25 years is another way of restating the inevitability politics thesis. Everyone's saying, whether you with approval or with frustration, that there is no alternative. Yeah, there is an alternative, right? This is it, or this is one of them. It could have been something else, right? It could have been something else, but there always is an alternative, and one has to start with accepting that other people can see the world in drastically different ways. Okay, and then I'm going to skip down to the very last thing that I want to say about lessons, which again helps, I think, hopefully to expand upon things which have already been said, and that's this. Exceptionalism is universal. Okay, everybody thinks he's exceptional. Yeah, everybody thinks he's exceptional, and of course you guys are exceptional, right? But everybody thinks that he or she is exceptional. Every country thinks that it's exceptional too, right? So when the reaction to, so I'll just give you an example. I was on the Diane Rame show way back when, and I was talking with a gentleman who said that Trump can't be fascist because we have freedom in our DNA, right? Which I thought, whoa, like A, that's kind of an interestingly Nazi thing to say, and B, right? B, if you are relying on American exceptionalism, right? If you're relying on some notion like freedom in your DNA, you are making it much less likely to be true, because that's not freedom. The idea that outside forces like the way that molecules are shaped in your body are going to save you is not freedom, right? That is a step away from freedom to say something like that, or to believe it, or to transmit that view to millions of other people, right? It's a step away precisely from freedom. So the moment that you find yourself saying, as I have heard, and as I know many people, I'll put it very vaguely, the idea that America is exceptional and therefore okay is the first step, right, in the regime change. There are related moves, right? Another related move is it can't happen here. Like, if you say it can't happen here, you should recognize that you're making it happen, okay? Because, I'm getting back to my conclusion again. There is actually no way out of history. All you can do is you can slough off your own responsibility, right? But when you slough off your own responsibility, you are taking part in history. There's no way out, right? So when you say it can't happen here, you're making it happen. You say it can't happen here, you're making it happen. When you say the institutions will save us, you're undermining the institutions, and therefore making it happen here, right? Therefore bringing about regime change in the United States. Because the institutions will only save you if you save them, right? It's not an ask what the institutions can do for you moment. It's an ask what you can do for the institutions moment, right? So all of these variants of exceptionalism are actually ways of taking part in the ongoing regime change in the United States. So or let me put it a different way. If you really think America is exceptional, okay, fine, like show me, right? Show me. Like, okay, I'm from Missouri, right? I'm not actually from Missouri. Missouri's the show me state. You all know that, right? Even though you're on the coast, Missouri's the show me state. Show me that America is exceptional, because I don't see it yet, right? And I'll put that slightly more sharply. I'm an American who spent his entire life traveling, right? Since Trump was elected, I've been a much happy traveler. And you know why? Because no one looks at me as an American and imagines that I have anything useful to offer. And that is such a relief. It's such a load it means I can just go about my business in a way that's never been possible before, right? And that's funny, but I'm not joking. It's true. No one looks at Americans now and says, you have something to offer as an American. No one does. No one. That's over. It's over. Okay, where was I? So, I was making America great again, which is the last thing that I wanted to say, okay? The obvious things to say about making America great again are America has not been less important in the world now it has less power in the world now than probably at any point since the mid-1930s, right? Just like that. But what I want to close with and bring us back to our theme is, when is the again in making America great again? I think it's the same again as in never again, right? The same again. That is to say, it's the 1930s. And so I just want to close with a remark about conservatism. What's happening now has nothing to do with conservatism, I don't think. Conservatism has a nostalgic view about the 1950s. Conservatism says things went bad, American conservatism, things went bad around 65, we started letting the immigrants in, things went bad with the pill, things went bad with resistance to the war, things went bad with women's lib, things went bad with sexual liberation. Okay, like that's one argument, right? That's the American Cultural War. Okay, that's one argument. Nostalgia for the 50s, though, is nostalgia for an America that A, has an incipient welfare state, and B, fought in the Second World War. If nostalgia is for the 1930s, as it now is, in the White House, if nostalgia is for the 1930s, then that's nostalgia for an America, which doesn't have a welfare state yet, pretty important, right? Which would be consistent with the ongoing destruction of the one we got. And it's also nostalgia for an America where the majority of the population was against fighting the Second World War. So it's not so surprising that we had a hard time, that would be a kind of generous the White House had a hard time with Holocaust Remembrance Day. Because if you don't really think that America should have fought against fascism, then that business about the Holocaust being some of our myth, you're going to be uncomfortable with that, right? Because we shouldn't have gone and fought the Germans. We shouldn't have, right? The 1930s, they're nostalgic. That wasn't me talking, by the way. That was in the quotation marks, right? You got that, thank you. So the notion is a nostalgia for an alternative 1930s. Lindbergh's 1930s. The America First 1930s, right? It's not an accident, as the Russians used to say, and will soon again say after they win. It's not an accident that we now have a themed foreign policy. Check the White House webpage. We don't just have foreign policy like we've always had. We now have America First foreign policy. For good measure, we have America First energy policy. And America First was the theme of the inauguration, not to mention the campaign, right? And what is America First? America First is precisely the idea that America should not have entered the Second World War to fight fascism, which brings me back to the politics of eternity. What we are in now is a world where not just Americans in the White House, but many of the Europeans that have been spoken about and many of the Russians who have been spoken about are actually explicitly or implicitly thinking of history as cyclical, as the 1930s as a place that one might go back to, and that this would be rather a good thing. And that's what I'm calling the politics of eternity. And so the place where I think we are is this shift, right? This shift of timescapes, which is uncomfortable and strange, where we've been balancing on this rolling log, we've been standing on this ball, which was inevitability, and suddenly it's gone, and we're slipping into the water. And as we fall into the currents, right, as we fall into the rushing currents, as we bang up against the rocks, we think, okay, this is how it has to be. It seemed like it was going to be like this, and now it's going to be like this. But the truth is somewhere else, right? The truth is that there is history, right? Sometimes perhaps a little bit more so than others. There is no way out of history. Imagining that things are always going to be great is a historical action which has bad consequences. Imagining that things are always going to be terrible is also a historical action which has worse consequences. So accepting that there is history is the first way to get some kind of solid ground under your feet and to start thinking about what you might actually want to do. Thanks.
Great. Well, we're gonna take a few minutes for questions, just to segue into that and to build from the solid ground beneath our feet. I anecdotally wanted to say when I was teaching Soviet literature last quarter, there was this one day in November when I taught Osip Mandelstam's poem, The Epigram to Stalin, which begins, we live not feeling the ground or the country beneath our feet. And then further on in the poem, there's this line that goes, Kak podkovu darit za ukazov ukaz, kому v pach, kому v lob, kому v brov, kому v glaz. Like horseshoes, he throws out edict after edict, someone in the groin, someone in the forehead, someone in the temple, someone in the eye. And my students sort of looked at me, puzzled, and one raised her hand and said, why would someone write something like that? Was he suicidal? And I did this thing that professors do when they're running out of time, and I said, think about it, we'll talk about it on Wednesday. And what happened between then and Wednesday was that there was an election, and then most of those students had gone out in the middle of the night and protested in the street, and a student was injured, and they all showed up. All but one student showed up in class on Wednesday morning at 9 a.m., and I just put up my PowerPoint slides where I'd left off on Monday, and there was this collective sort of, it wasn't, they got it. And that moment of getting it, that moment of understanding, I really want to hold on to that moment of feeling like there is something. It's not that history is repeating itself, but that there's something to be gained from needing to take action. That's something that I don't want to lose into complacency as we move forward. So with that, let's, I saw two hands shoot up over here. So first, second. We have one microphone, so if I don't know if we want to pass it back and forth, or if you want to speak up.
I want to address my comments specifically to Dr. Shore. The term liberal democracy is so bound up together that we just say it as one word. I want to thank you for disentangling it, because it seems to me, from hearing your talk, that liberalism is really a kind of moral philosophy in a way, right? And that democracy is really a political term. And many times I've heard people criticize the Age of Enlightenment, but it ends up being an apologist for the Enlightenment. And I think your talk seems to be a true criticism of the Enlightenment for failing to understand that rationalism itself is not a total basis for democracy, that passions and consumption and desire are very important, and they did not build enough structure into institutions that require that to sustain liberalism adjacent to democracy, and that's part of the reason why things are failing. If you agree with what I thought you said, could you comment on that? If not, could you explain further?
Maybe let's collect a couple questions in a row. That's a good idea. There's one right next to you. There was someone who had his hand up as well.
I have dozens of comments, but are going to be two very, very short ones. One, my accent proves your point that people do move once in a while. And the other is that even though I've been on the faculty at the University of Michigan for 55 years, I happen to have spent my sabbatical at UCSD from 1969 to 1970. So I want to compliment you at this meeting, because that was the year when Marcuse, Angela Davis, and everybody else controlled the campus. And I don't think we could have had a panel discussion like that at that time.
I just have an interesting observation on the idea that history has similar patterns, but it doesn't actually repeat itself. Because one of the difference that I see that, well, there's lots of parallels between today's history and the 1930s, the rise of rights nationalism, rights populism, and fascism. There are also a lack of like genuine ideological battle, which is absent today, because in the 30s it's marked by generally ideological battle between the right and the new of growing and diverse left-wing movements and anti-fascist movement, which not only lead to the direct defeat of fascism around the world, but also leads to the post-war progressive movements of the civil rights movement or the new left movements, in which these momentum no longer exist today, and there's a large power vacuum today. And we do see a little bit of left populist movement for the past few years, but it's being comparatively weak and incompetent. This is just an interesting observation. I don't know if any of you have any comment on this.
I like the unifying concept of grievances in terms of bringing a lot together, and I understand that that's always there. But the wave across the world, I'm wondering if it's normalizing the whole idea, or it's curious to me that it should be just sweeping across the world the way it is. And I wonder what you can say to that, or if you do think that every time it's happening, it ignites more of a fire under the next place that's having the elections or the next place.
So I'm Dave Edick, past president of the San Diego World Affairs Council. The European Union and NATO expanded into the land where anything is possible. What are the implications for these two important Western institutions with these current politics?
Unfortunately, I have to leave. I've got another engagement, so thank you. I will look forward to seeing this on
Okay, I'll make a couple of comments. So on the EU and NATO, I mean, we're discussing now events which are part of the history of the last 25 years. The debate on EU enlargement began in 1989 when states emerged from communism. In 1993, association agreements were signed between formerly communist East European states and what had then just barely started to be called the European Union, which were heavily prejudicial in terms of trade, that is to say highly protectionist against East Europeans, basically prejudicial in general, but which included, at the insistence of the aspiring members, at least a bit in the prologue about how they wanted to be members, but no promise. Much of the history then from 1989 to 2004 is the process of East European elites and in general populations accommodating their systems to various European Union norms, which were themselves being articulated as part of the enlargement process. So the thing that I hesitate about the formulation of the question is that we can talk about the European Union expanding as though this was like, you know, pulling into a parking place or something. But in fact, it was a huge historical process, which itself took 15 years and arguably much longer, because the consensus that formed in Eastern Europe about the so-called return to Europe was a result of the previous 25 years of thinking, roughly the mid-60s. The idea that somewhere between capitalism and communism would be some space called Europe, which of course was articulated differently. So we're really looking at a process which takes, you know, almost half a century. And so I hesitate a bit when commentators today talk about the EU sort of rushing into Eastern Europe, because that didn't happen. The EU never rushes anywhere, right? It was essentially forced to enlarge. And as for what that meant, I mean, I would say that it gave the EU a meaning, the closest thing to a political meaning that it's ever had. The project of extending the rule of law is the closest thing to a mission that the European Union has ever had. I think without it, it would have been in crisis much sooner than it is now. It also made the likelihood, remembering everything we've said about the possibility of authoritarian outcomes, in particular Patrick's point about Croatia and Slovakia, it made it much more likely that these states would be liberal democracies, right? So I would take the enlargement of the European Union to be, you know, if we all think that liberalism and democracy are good things, I would take it to be generally a success. And I would point out that the major challenges to the existence of the European Union come from A, Russia, which is outside the European Union and which regards it as an enemy, and B, major members of the European Union that are West European countries, that is to say Great Britain, right, and France. So Poland and Hungary are not doing us any favors, but the main threats to the European Union come from outside. Likewise, NATO. If it weren't for NATO expansion, I think we would be dealing with a much bloodier and much more difficult quarter century than we've had, right? So part of our politics of inevitability now is that we forget the hard work and the difficult debates of the late 80s and early 90s. So NATO enlargement, there was a big debate around NATO enlargement, again, from 89 until 94, at which point it was basically done in the US. And the consensus in the US and the aspiring members was this will make conflict among the aspiring members less likely, right? And there haven't been conflicts among EU members, and there haven't been conflicts among NATO members. So, I mean, what I see is a much larger process in which Russia, the United States, and to some extent Great Britain and France have lost their own sense of direction, right? The European Union project continues to be not only a zone of peace, but also the biggest economy in the history of the world, right? I mean, that's by the way what Fox News leads every day with, right? Have you noticed that? Every day Fox News says, the European Union, it's the biggest economy in the history of the world, right? I'm joking. They've never said that, right? I mean, come on. But anyway, right? It is. It's the biggest. It's bigger than China. It's bigger than us. It's the biggest economy in the history of the world, right? And if we have to have visas to travel to Europe, that's going to hurt us. It's going to hurt. Okay. Anyway, the next thing I wanted to say was about about grievance and truth and ideology. I want to try to lump all these questions. It's pretty important that there be some basis, there's some factual basis. I'm talking about your ideology question. It seems to me that there is a lot more ideology at play than maybe your question recognizes, and the big ideological divide is between fact and fiction. We didn't even get into this, but I think the real clash in the world today, at least from Russia through the West to America, is whether there's a factual world or not. You know, going back to Patrick, he wasn't actually joking about the world part, right? The question about whether there's a real world or not, or whether it's all just, PR, as the Poles say, or PED, as the Russians say, I think that's actually the big ideological divide. It's not right-left anymore. And fact and fiction lines up pretty closely with grievance and not grievance, because if you accept that there are facts, then the grievances aren't the only thing at play. If we accept that there are facts, we can at least talk about slavery or talk about NATO enlargement or talk about whatever it might be. But once there's no facts, like once there's just a narrative, like my narrative is that slavery was nice and yours is that it's not nice, but you have to respect my opinion because of the First Amendment. Once we're in that world, then grievances tend to bubble up. And at every fractal level, I think, from the internet to geopolitics, that's a lot of what's been happening. So I actually think the ideologies aren't as interesting as they were in the 20s and 30s, but I think they're actually present. And I think also one thing we tend to overlook is that the moral and intellectual basis of fascism is precisely the denial of the real world, right? When we think of post-factuality, we think of the French, and so we think of nice things. We think of berets and we think of cafes. But we should be thinking about the 1920s and fascism, because it's actually, Sorel is a Frenchman, but not the one we're thinking of. It's the notion that there should be a myth of a great leader, the notion that our experience should be a collective experience, the notion that your individual everyday apprehension of reality is irrelevant, that's fascism. And that's not exactly the same thing, but it is strikingly close to the post-factual side of this debate. Okay.
Okay, on the Enlightenment, yes, I think you understood me very well. So, the Enlightenment begins with, what Weber calls disenchantment. So we move God to the side, the world is no longer magical, things don't happen by divine right. In its place, we celebrate human reason. We have this extraordinary human reason which gives us the power to understand the world and therefore improve the world, and we move towards human perfectibility because we have this wonderful thing called human reason. And the Enlightenment assumes that all good things go together. It assumes that virtue and self-interest naturally coincide. It assumes that everybody using their reason is going to come to a nice harmonious way of living. It was then countered, not just today, but all way back then, and this is going back to some of Stephen's references, with Romanticism, and in particular with German Romanticism. And then with the Enlightenment, which takes its conception of the human subject from Descartes, says, I think, therefore I am. And the Romantics say, no, it's not thinking that grounds human subjectivity. It's not the cogito that grounds the self, it's desire. It's not I think, therefore I am, it's I desire, I want, therefore I am. That was the Romantic rebellion against Enlightenment. And all the way, leap forward to Nazi Germany when the great philosopher Edmund Husserl is thrown out of the university as a non-Aryan and goes to Prague, invited among other people by Jan Patočka to deliver the lectures that he can no longer deliver in Nazi Germany. And he says, because Enlightenment rationalism was conceived too superficially, because it failed to understand the depth of human subjectivity, it has therefore left itself vulnerable to the forces of irrationalism and barbarism. And that was the beginning of a line of philosophical critiques of, kind of post-romantic philosophical critiques of Enlightenment that then run from not just the Romantics, but from Husserl through Adorno and Horkheimer and all the way up to Foucault and postmodernism. The Enlightenment, which its ideas that, Isaiah Berlin would say the tragic flaw was that not all good things go together. You have the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which seems to be victorious in France in 1789, and liberty, equality, and fraternity. And then Isaiah Berlin says, well, the problem is that you can't actually have complete liberty and complete equality, that, actually those two things tend to be in tension, and security tends to act against freedom and mercy against justice, and that, in fact, we live in this world of tragic contradictions that we're constantly forced to work through. And so the fragility of liberalism, I think, is a direct reflection of the kind of fragility of Enlightenment reason. I mean, I keep thinking of Czesław Miłosz's comment in The Captive Mind that he writes just after he defects from Stalinist Poland in 1951. And he says, the habit of civilization is fragile. You know, a sudden change in circumstances and man reverts to its primeval savagery. And I feel like this is what's being laid bare now. The habit of civilization is fragile.
I just wanted to add a very short point to the comment about the separation of liberalism and democracy. I think, especially in the East European experience, the protection of societies is not just a protection of liberalism and democracy, let's say, but a protection of republican virtues. And a lot of those virtues, which make us uneasy when we have to talk about values and morals and ethics and those things, especially in politics, are not just modern. They go back, like Masaryk in my example, to the ancient world. Many of these intellectuals, sociologists, especially philosophers, were polymaths, dilettantes. They just read everything. And I really can't say the same about the aggressively anti-liberal fellow travelers or the people who are complicit, as Tim puts it, in watching Facebook 14 hours a day.
To stop the formal part of our presentation today, I want to have you join me in thanking the speakers for this really thought-provoking panel.